Good. Yeah, it's good to see you all. So we're gonna just have a short Bible study on. So I was just telling the folks earlier. We, instead of having a talk, we're gonna actually have like a more interactive Bible study. Look at a passage together, and it's actually a fairly well-known passage. But God willing, understanding this passage will help us to um, understand our need to grow in the knowledge of the Lord, and also will help us, God willing, to um, be wise when we are dealing with other people in the church, other Christians that maybe struggle a bit to be mature, to understand um, um, the things of God, to understand scriptures. So hopefully, looking at this passage, we will learn to be patient with them, and will help also to look at ourselves and see our need to grow. You might remember Paul says to the church in Corinth, that they are still having milk and they should be having solid food, and that's God's will for all believers, that we may grow in maturity and become more and more mature. Um, yeah, so if you could open your Bibles on Mark chapter 8, and we're going to be looking at verses 22 to 26 at the start. So Mark chapter 8, verses 22 to 26. We're going to read more verses as we go on, but for now, let's just start with that. So my Bible says, and they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. And he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." Now, I was wondering, what do you guys find awkward, let's say, in this passage, or unexpected things that we don't expect and that we see in this passage? There are quite few, actually.
Jesus spitting on the man's eyes.
Yeah, that was very unusual.
The two-stage miracle.
Two stages miracle. Yeah, so Jesus didn't heal the blind man completely on the first touch. So that's weird. What about verse 23? Right at the start, and he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village.
Yes, he didn't want a lot of people watching what was happening.
Yeah.
No, he didn't want to make a fuss, did he?
Yes, yeah, that's very interesting. So we have at least three awkward things going on in this passage. So the first one is Jesus heals the man outside of the village. He takes the man by the hand, takes him out of the village. So in other words, he didn't want the people that were in the village to see the miracle for some reason. We don't know yet why. The second weird thing is Jesus spits on the man's eye. Why did Jesus do that? And then the third weird thing is the healing doesn't happen on the first time that Jesus touched him, but it took him a while. So let's say, imagine you're coming to this passage for the first time, and then you look at it, and what would be some of the issues? What would be some of the questions that would be raised because of this awkward things we saw in the passage? Would there any questions pop up on our minds? So I think, for example, one of the questions that people, let's say someone is reading this passage for the first time, the person is not a Christian, and they go and read this passage, and they see Jesus not able to heal a blind man on the first touch. So they would think, well, maybe Jesus is not that powerful. That could be one issue. Or maybe they would think, well, spitting on other people's eyes is not a nice thing, or Jesus, he didn't want people to know that he was powerful because he took the man out of the village, so he doesn't care if he's known or not. So what are some of the options for the man not being healed on the first touch? What do you think could be the reason? Now, maybe if we look at the context of the passage, that will help us understand. So I'll read verses, let me see. Yeah, verses 11 to 13 of chapter 8. Mark 8, 11 to 13. It says, the Pharisees came and began to argue with him, seeking from him a sign from heaven to test him. And he sighed deeply in his spirit and said, why does this generation seek a sign? Truly I say to you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them, got into the boat again, and went to the other side. Let me read verse 14 to 21 as well. Now they had forgotten to bring bread, and they had only one loaf with them in the boat. And he cautioned them, saying, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they began discussing with one another the fact that they had no bread. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, you do not hear? And do you not remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? They said to him, 12. And the 7 for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you take up? And they said to him, 7. And he said to them, do you not yet understand? So we have this passage we just read, and then just after that is the passage of the blind man. And I want to call your attention to verses 17 to verse 17. And Jesus, aware of this, said to them, why are you discussing the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? So we already see a connection. Jesus making this connection between eyes and not being able to see, and not being able to understand. So Jesus didn't want to give this man a sign, the Pharisees a sign. And that's the funny thing as well, because there is these people, the Pharisees, they are asking for a sign because they want to see, they want to test Jesus and see. So it's really interesting that all these connections. The Pharisees want to see a sign. You have the disciples. Do you not yet see? Jesus asks the disciples, and then the blind man, who can't see, let's go on. Maybe we read another few verses. Let's read verses 27 onwards, 27 to 33. It says, and Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, who do people say that I am? And they told him, John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others say one of the prophets. And he asked them, But who do you say that I am? Peter answered him, you are the Christ. And he strictly charged them not to tell no one about him. And he began to teach that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. So again, we have something very interesting about understanding. So Peter, he says, you are the Christ, you know. And then in another gospel, we have Jesus saying, it wasn't flesh or blood who revealed this to you, you know, but my Father in heaven. So Peter really understood, you know, he really understood who Jesus was. You are the Christ. Meanwhile, all these other people, they didn't understand. The Pharisees, they couldn't understand Jesus. The other folk around, you know, that Jesus asked, who do people say that I am? And they said, you know, maybe one of the prophets or Elijah and so on. They couldn't understand Jesus either, you know, but Peter could. Peter could, because he says, you are the Christ. Now, when Jesus says, when Jesus tells his mission as the Christ, that is, I'm to suffer, to be rejected, to be crucified, and to rise on the third day, what does Peter do? You know, Peter rebukes Jesus. So Peter, so there's the question: is Peter able to understand who Jesus is, or is he not?
I guess we would react like Peter, wouldn't we? Don't talk about dying and suffering. Just talk about leading us to victory against the Romans, you know.
Yeah, maybe he thought Jesus was going to be a great political leader,
Yeah,
you know, who would bring freedom to the Jewish state from the emperors. And there's a lot of people that think that Jesus, you know, he was a really nice teacher, and he, you know, or others think that he was you know, a political leader, really, you know, who taught us good things, you know, and that's really far from the reality, you know. So Peter, he's in a very interesting position, because at the same time that he says that Jesus is the Christ, he can't understand the Christ's mission, you know. And that might help us to understand Jesus taking the blind man out of the village and performing the miracle in front of his disciples only. You know, because Jesus, he didn't want people to well, I would argue from this passage that Jesus didn't want people to everyone to see that miracle, because the lesson of that miracle was specifically to the disciples. And I think what Mark is doing by putting all these passages together is basically showing us that Jesus with the blind man was given an illustration of Peter, you know, because the blind man, after the first time that Jesus touches him, is he still blind? Well, we can't say that he is blind, you know, because he is seeing something. He sees men like trees. But can we say that he is able to see? Well, we can't say that he's able to see either, you know. So he's in a very interesting position. And the same thing with Peter, you know, understanding who Jesus is. Was Peter able to see who Jesus really was? Yes, because he says that Jesus is the Christ. But was he able to understand fully who Jesus was? Well, maybe no, because he wasn't able to understand the Christ's mission. So yeah, so I think that's the big question we should ask ourselves, in a sense. Can we really understand who Jesus was? If we think that he was a political leader or a great teacher or something along those lines, we clearly can't understand who Jesus really was. But if we see him as the Christ, then we can see Jesus for who he really was. And I guess, as I said at the beginning, this should help us to also be patient with other folk in the church who seem to get a lot of stuff right and yet seem to get a lot of stuff wrong as well. And we should be patient and understand that maybe they are on that stage, of half blindness, half being able to see, and we should be patient and by God's grace try to help them to see fully and to fully understand who Jesus was and Jesus' mission. And I guess also speaks of our own necessity to grow in maturity, that we should not be infants in our faith, but we should grow in the knowledge of our Savior and truly understand the scriptures and truly understand who Jesus is, so that we may have a more joyful life, knowing the Lord better, because that's always a good thing, isn't it?